Hello. All right. How's everybody doing? You're in the biggest room here, I think. This is a little bit big. All right. Well, we're going to go ahead and get started here. We have actually three sessions back to back. They all kind of tie together. So if you guys are with us for the next 3 sessions, awesome. If you're just here for this, thank you for joining. The session is the evolving digital identity landscape, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. But real quick, who am I? I'm Travis Jarae. I'm the CEO of Liminal. We are an actionable market intelligence and strategy firm that focuses squarely on digital identity, fintech, and cybersecurity. We take a different look at things. In fact, the majority of work that we do at Liminal is private equity focused. So the bulk of our client base are private equity investors, typically looking at this market, how to make sense of it, what the trends are, where the investment opportunities are, which allows us to spend most of our time talking to buyers and sellers and figuring out where those arbitrage opportunities are, right? What's unique technology, what's being supplied in the market, and where is there still outstanding demand. So excited for today's conversation. But really quickly, just want to kind of ground us into our perspective on digital identity, and it's this life cycle. We try not to create terms at Liminal. We try to take what's out there, but we talk to a lot of folks, a lot of boards that don't really know identity. And so how do you make sense of this very complicated conversation with a bunch of folks that don't really care too much? And so we start with the creation side of things, and you can create identity in a whole bunch of different ways. And I think we have a verifiable credential panel here, or a session in a bit. Then we go to verification, where there's been a lot of conversation, a lot of money, a lot of time building out products and services in the verification space, specifically with solving that fintech account opening use case. And then we move to authentication, which I know many of you in this room work on, really. And then we move into authorization, which I think Andre really hit it on the head, where this industry really hasn't solved many of the authorization issues. And then, of course, ending up to federation. So once we have an identity that can come back into an ecosystem, we know what it can do. How can we take that identity and use it into multiple new ecosystems? And we make sense of this customer lifecycle, this journey, with our own digital identity landscape. So just by a show of hands, who has followed or knows of our digital identity landscape? Awesome. All right. So just by way of introducing how we look at this space, because it's a little bit different than I think most people look at anything. What we try to really understand when we build our landscapes is we try to understand, what the hell is this thing? What is this space that we all work in? And to do that, we really need to define a brand new landscape each year, and we actually do that. So we start in July, and it goes in through December, where we redefine our landscape. And we do that by understanding all of the product features that you guys work on, and how those interact, and not just on a use case perspective, but also how does it interact with other adjacent product features and solution segments. So that helps us really build up a good view of all of the different solution segments. Each solution segment has about 10 or so product features, 15 or so product features, and then we try to understand what those dominating forces are between each product feature. And to do that, we go talk to several thousand people. We survey the market, and we try to understand what are the major impacting forces across each of these solution segments, and we try to measure that relational value, right? So if one year we hear that document authentication is really important, and then everyone goes and builds document authentication, well, the buyers the next year say, that's solved. We don't need document authentication anymore. We need OCR scanning technology for China again. It's like, okay, well, that's a little bit different, but let's figure out what the relational value is of those product features. Once we have a good understanding of the product features and the relational value of each product feature within the solution segments, then we actually can start to layer on a different level of insight. In this case, we look at segment types. So the segment types that we look at are really kind of represented by these little icons. But you have platforms, which really indicate where there's a large grouping of supply and demand. You have your enablers, where there's a large grouping of demand by platforms, but not buyers. So you can probably think of several products out there that exist where buyers don't really want to buy that on their own, but they want to have it into a solution set or a platform. Ubiquitous features, these are really represented by features that live in many different solution segments. So we see this a lot with authenticators, with biometrics technology. And then lastly, we have golden cogs, which is something that we end up defining at the very end after we understand each solution segment and the influence that they have on the market. And the golden cogs are the most interesting pieces to us. These are the unknowns. These are the enablers today, but could be platforms in the future. They could be ubiquitous features. We don't really know, but we know there's a market for it. There's heavy demand for these things. And we know that there are different market forces, whether that's regulatory, policy-driven, customer-base driven, whatever the major influence is, to really help define the segment, but really still trying to understand what that vended ratio is going to look like. We also try to understand the data that sits underneath it, which is the color here. So you'll see referential, self-managed data, inferential and probabilistic data, and referential deterministic data as kind of the major data types that we're looking at. And that really makes more sense for a product manager or engineer trying to figure out, what's the level of security that they're actually going to need for this, or how much can we actually trust this. So for example, if we have a banking use case, typically we're going to look at the deterministic solution segments. So here is our 2023 liminal digital identity landscape, represented by 33 different solution segments. And as I mentioned, this changes every year. So if you've seen one in the past, it has changed. I think this was released in February, mostly because I didn't finish it in December. So, but this is what we ended up with. So 33 different solution segments. There's been some notable changes over this past year, over previous years, but less changes than historically. So some of the new ones on here we'll kind of talk about, but we've extended kind of the decentralized identity, verifiable credential management solution segment. We've updated IoT to machine identity, as per our expert Gilad, who'll be speaking here in a bit. We've added a brand new solution segment called persona and signals-based intelligence, which is one of those, like, we don't really know what it is, but everybody really wants it kind of scenario. So it's super interesting. They want all of the product features of the old MarTech solutions that are really bad for privacy, but they want to use it for fraud prevention. Trying to square that up. So if you guys have any thoughts on that, we'd love to kind of hear it. We have a few companies in that landscape today. One of those is Deep Labs, which we'll be speaking with tomorrow on this session about age assurance, but really looking at kind of the breadth of how we use things like open source intelligence, as well as other signals-based intelligence methods and techniques for different use cases. And then to kind of move us forward just a little bit here are the golden cogs. I just talked about PSBI, persona and signals-based intelligence, and DIDS, verifiable credential management. But the other golden cogs that we spend most of our time on are the EIDs, civil IDs, which for who in the room is working on something EID related right now? All right, my man too. All right, a couple people. Okay, big area. We're going to talk about it. It's going to be one of the big trends here. Little spoiler alert, but obviously very, very important to the future of this space. Hard to kind of split out the difference between the public side, the private side, and the public-private partnerships on the EID, civil IDs, but we're going to try to break that down here in a bit. Business and entity verification, KYB. Who's working on something KYB related? All right, we have a next session on that. But this is an area that has not really been solved for at all, but a massive problem out in the market. And our buyers are still really, really looking for better solutions. So if you guys are looking for use cases to solve fintech entity verification, you're welcome. I'll see you guys next year, and we can talk about how successful you guys are. Privacy, data protection, and consent. A golden cog, one, because it's very, very important, and two, there's not a whole lot of companies focused on it. So out of our landscape, we have sub 30 companies out of 3,000 that fit into this solution segment, but it's vitally critical to what we work on. So here are our 6 golden cogs. We don't only focus on these golden cogs, but these are the segments that we're getting a lot of questions about. These are the segments that our buyers really want to know about more. And this is where we're seeing that open question of what is out in market good enough? And if it's good enough, will it become the next big platform solution? So with that, just to kind of move us along, we've highlighted 3 big trends outside of the golden cogs that we are currently focusing on that are pushing this entire market forward. The first is passwordless. I think every single room here right now probably has a passwordless conversation going on. But FIDO2, I think Andrew's right here, just gave us that keynote. Accelerating the passwordless authentication, conversation, and adoption. Obviously, big tech really kind of playing a meaningful role with that with Google, Microsoft, and friends, kind of pushing that forward. People are realizing, buyers are realizing that passwordless authentication reduces risk. A couple years ago, when we were evaluating passwordless and how solutions work like that, right, people were okay with SMS OTP. People were okay with passwords. I mean, they didn't say that in as many words, but they weren't willing to adopt or pay for passwordless solutions. That is changing very, very quickly. This is a big conversation that every one of the buyers that we interview with has a pretty good roadmap for getting rid of any sort of password or SMS OTP, which is the last piece of the trend here, which is SMS OTP volumes will be heavily impacted. So if your business is relying on SMS OTP, and there's a few companies out there that do that, this is obviously a major impacting event for you guys. So we also try to highlight what solution segments does passwordless really kind of impact the most. And that's your access management, your authentication, your biometrics, and fraud prevention and detection. In a positive way. These are where we're seeing the most buyers, the most group of buyers that are really interested in bringing kind of passwordless solutions to the forefront. And obviously our password managers and mobile identity players are negatively impacted. I think we saw a few password manager folks down in the expo hall making some meaningful changes, getting ahead of this trend, adopting passwordless solutions, right? Trying to own that narrative. Smart, right? They're trying to change the entire game by being ahead of that. So when we reached out to the market on this, actually we did a large due diligence for an SMS OTP vendor, CPaaS vendor, at the end of last year. This is what our survey actually came back with, which is, I think, shocking for many. But we do see the SMS OTP volume dropping significantly by 2026. Our second big trend is the rise of EIDs. So we had 2 folks, I think, mentioning that they're working on or have EIDs kind of in their roadmap. So these are electronic IDs. These are mostly, you're seeing these throughout Europe. So you'll see Eids 2.0 as a standard that a lot of folks are talking about. In the US, we have mobile driver license ISO standards, highly fragmented in terms of how they're getting rolled out. Right, so you're seeing today multiple different states taking multiple different approaches. So the U.S. is a wreck, but the rest of the world is seemingly figuring this thing out. And that's where a lot of folks are spending their time. There's a company called Signicat that has been kind of the forefront of the EID market for quite some time. And if you go study Signicat, you'll see that they have gone around country by country picking up the EID networks for each of those countries and trying to build a network approach. But still having a lot of difficulty when it comes down to cross-border EID transactions. So if you're thinking about how can I play a meaningful role with something that's already kind of established, figure out that cross-border relationship between countries, because that's where we're seeing the most interest and also where there's very little supply in the market. As I kind of mentioned, Europe is leading the way. There's 22 EID schemes. We'll come to that in a second. And then lastly, for the most part, EIDs have been produced by the public sector. Governments have done it, so you've probably heard of Bank ID. How many folks have heard of Bank ID? Which one? Norway, Sweden? Which one do you guys want? Yeah. Everyone kind of picked up the same name and went with it. But good, so you guys understand Bank ID. Highly unprofitable business model because it's a service. It's a government service. So how do you take a government service and make it less of a utility and more of a private sector approach? So we are seeing some interesting private-public partnerships come to the forefront, and that's really where we see private sector having the biggest opportunity, that interoperability between public and private relationships. And just want to kind of show where this landscape is currently. We have kind of in the dark blue, the launched schemes where there's the existing infrastructure in place with over 25% adoption. And we're seeing some developing schemes where it's lacking that adoption, but there is some meaningful conversations happening. So rest of world, not really taking this on. Obviously, you got Russia, China kind of being very large land masses on this. But for the most part, we have a lot of different approaches to this. Like I said, 22 European EID schemes. I think we track about 36 different EID schemes today. And there are also multiple consortiums that are now starting to arise to also kind of build some standardization across the landscape. All right, the last trend that we are really hyper-focused on, and this is very much buyer-driven, is the concept of an integrated identity platform. By show of hands here, who's heard of integrated identity platforms before? A few folks? Okay. All right, cool. Well, it is a term that I think we'll probably be hearing a lot more about. But generally speaking, we're looking at a single platform approach that goes across the entire customer life cycle, right? So pre-onboarding, onboarding, authentication, authorization, transaction monitoring, deprovisioning, right? That entire customer life cycle. Didn't start at identity creation, it was before that, right? So it's not at onboarding, it's pre-onboarding as well. And we're seeing buyers. I recently had a conversation last week, actually, with the head of security at Airbnb. And she was telling me, I don't want another vendor. I want one vendor. And that's the story we're hearing from everybody. We want one vendor that has access to multiple solutions. Obviously, we're hearing a lot about orchestration vendors. That's not something super new, but even the orchestration vendors aren't really fulfilling the needs of the companies that are demanding it, right? So trying to really figure out a way to have a single integrated platform that is curating all of these different solutions across the entire customer lifecycle, from compliance, fraud, risk, security. We do think that this has some meaningful impact on multiple companies. Obviously, we try to say impacted versus partially impacted on the solution segment map here. It's pretty much the entire landscape is impacted by this. But the biggest impact is, one, of course, if you're a platform solution, now you're focused on finding partner solutions to be able to sell, to meet your customers' demands. And also you're seeing smaller companies that maybe don't have the scale, breadth, and size of the larger platforms that already have customer adoption really struggle to get any customer meetings to date, right? So they're really starting to focus more on selling through channel themselves. This is going to drive a whole new wave of white label OEM solutions. And we're already starting to see that. So last summer, we actually started to see more companies that had very niche, very good technology solutions start to sell themselves through channel, through these larger platforms that have customer relationships. So if you're thinking, hey, that sounds a little bit like me, be thinking about a channel partnership strategy, be thinking about how to integrate with a larger platform. What does that strategic relationship look like? Yesterday on the main stage, we had both Visa and Experian on stage. Kathleen at Experian, for those that aren't familiar with the Experian product, but it's called CrossCore. That's a good example of an integrated identity platform where they have many customers and they are trying to orchestrate the right solutions. So look at those larger businesses as a way to sell your products through them. So as I kind of mentioned, we had those market forces really driving a lot of consolidation from a customer perspective, but also we're going to see that drive a lot of consolidation in terms of M&A. So the majority of our work, as I mentioned before, is private equity led. It's not on investments. It's not on secondaries. It's on roll-ups. It's on merging assets to fit into this integrated identity platform story. All right, so you're going to be seeing a lot of this happening. We have a very bold prediction, which probably won't come true, but you guys can quote me on it. By the end of 2024, most of this space will either be acquired or be an acquirer. So let's just think about that for a second. So a lot of businesses will be folded into larger platforms to satisfy this integrated identity platform approach. Just by the numbers, so you can kind of have these here as well, 48% of enterprises are using 4+ vendors right now in onboarding. They want one. So gone are the days where a vendor will just say, we're going to integrate you, and if we use you, cool. If not, not great, right? We pop open the hood on a lot of different companies, and we see the same logos. Capital One does not use 1,000 vendors, I assure you, right? So what does that really mean? Well, they're going to be dropping a lot of vendors out of the stack. They're going to be focusing on these integrated identity platforms to be able to offer those solutions. So see less of those opportunities to get account value transaction-based contracts sold, and more focused on trying to actually get fixed contracts in place with these vendors. 67% of enterprises plan to switch over the next 18 months to more robust platforms. So while it's not happening immediately, we do expect this to happen over the next 2 years. And a lot of that's driven just by the fact there's just not a lot of integrated identity platforms that can service this demand. And we expect this market to grow significantly. So 27% CAGR between 2023 and 2027. It's a massive market because, just to flip back a slide, it covers a lot of the landscape. All right, so this is a massive market opportunity for folks. And if you're in the room right now, this is the biggest trend that probably will have a meaningful impact on your business, either as a buyer or a seller. So with that, I think we have time for a couple questions. Yes. We also.
Yeah, so regarding the integrated platforms, that seems like that's really demanding from the seller side. We haven't addressed the technology underlying. Anytime you take multiple technologies and try to mash them together, there is not always great success.
Yeah.
Have you had any conversations or feedback regarding that perspective of actually trying to mash all these technologies, aggregate them all?
Yeah. I mean, 70% of integrations that include multiple technologies fail. We know that.
Like, how do these people think this is going to succeed when it doesn't really succeed when they're actually like in their own, they have their own integrity?
You know, buyers aren't always logical in that, right? But that's what they want, that's what they're demanding, and they're expecting companies to really focus purely on the integration, making this actually work. Bringing in the right partners, not making it all partners for all platforms, but saying, hey, this is the curated list of platform or solutions that we want to be able to provide, and these work well together. There's a good company called Alloy. I don't know how many folks are familiar with Alloy out in the market, but they've done a really good job at kind of creating this idea of focusing purely on the integrations for the partners. But what they ended up creating was this massive library of companies and solutions. Really great if you know what you're looking at, a little bit more difficult if you don't. So there's going to be some buyer education that's going to need to happen, and probably a lot of scraped knees as people kind of trip on their feet on this one.
I just wonder the situation where like the buyers are saying what they want, but that's not really what they want. Really what they want is interoperable solutions that work within their systems, that's easy, that they don't have to deal with like a bunch of different stuff. And I think there's other ways that need can be addressed without having massive aggregation.
I hope you're right. I think right now, today, yeah, absolutely. I think we have a microphone too, but might be running out of time. The question is, do buyers want, or does it make more sense to focus on the end-to-end journey, or bringing the right solutions into an integration point, right? A point of integration. So right now, we've been seeing mostly folks focused on one piece of the customer journey. So we want an onboarding vendor and maybe a authentication vendor. Right? So they'll focus on those two. So onboarding plus the next step of authentication, they'll want those two things to be working well together. So we're seeing platforms really combine those assets. But long term, we do see that the end-to-end journey is going to be where the demand is lying. Yeah, one more question.
On your landscape diagrams, where the hexagon or whatever,
Yeah.
is there adjacent to each other because those solutions are adjacent to each other, or is there something?
Exactly. All of these, I'm just picking this one here. You can ignore the dots on it. Each solution segment here is adjacent for a reason. These are actually how the solutions work in practicality. So you can actually look at all the product features by use case, and they should be congruent. And so if you go to map out your own company on this landscape and you don't have congruency, then you probably don't have a complete solution for your buyers. It's going to create confusion. Unless, of course, you're trying to service multiple buyers and multiple domains. We would obviously say that's difficult. But generally speaking, these are adjacent because this is actually how they work in practicality. So. All right, one more.
So looking at this, I always keep thinking to watch three-quarter of the race get one race wall. And while it's certainly a trend, I guess the question is, how does this trend encourage and promote the utilization of digital identity innovation when we recognize that the attack surface and the changes of the people who wish to make our lives a little upsetting come into play?
So just to kind of rephrase the question there, you're asking one ring to rule them all. Can we make this, is this creating too much of an attack surface for fraudsters, for folks, right?
Yep. And with innovation on our side on how we deal with not just simply security, but quite frankly, new microservices.
Yeah. I think that is exactly the big question and the opportunity for everybody in this room, right? This is a buyer-driven demand trend, right? That was called out. So I would definitely say that we need multiple solutions that we're not even thinking about or that we're even putting together in a platform today to be able to protect every use case that we're going to be trying to service with this.
So theoretically, while it may be a trend, it may not necessarily be a good trend.
Depends where you sit. I think this is a trend that we're seeing the investors put their money behind. But let's take that offline because I think I'm 5 minutes over. Really appreciate it. Thank you, everybody.